Architect Divya Chakravarti. She completed her undergraduate studies from SRM University and she went on to pursue her master's in historic preservation and urbanism and study of the built environment from the University of California, Los Angeles. She went on to work for the Department of Planning and Preservation for the city of Pasadena, California. She also did a brief stint of work for Historic Scotland, Edinburgh, UK. She also worked on conservation projects like Khalsa Mahal, Gokhale Hall in Chennai, and Marimalappa Educational Trust in Mysore. She is currently working as a director of Samrakshan Heritage Consultancy. She is also a co-founder of the Artisan Reprisal of Traditional Materials, Method and Technology. She goes on to conduct workshops to revive traditional and lost methods of construction.
Welcome to the UGC lecture sessions. This is the course for Bachelors of Architecture, Architectural Conservation. This is the lecture second for the Unit 1, Introduction to Conservation. The topics we'll be discussing in this session is heritage conservation, the need, debate and purpose, the distinction between architectural and urban conservation, and the role of international global agencies like ICCROM, UNESCO, and their role in conservation. So, in the previous session we started with the basics of conservation and the purpose of conservation. To continue in the same vein, the next important purpose of conservation is it strengthens the community. It not only boosts tourism in a particular place, but it adds a sense of local pride amongst the people. It fosters economic development, which is very crucial. And within this particular scope of place, it adds a sense of pride and belonging. With pride, people can say, yes, this building comes into I live near this particular heritage building. I belong to this particular city which hosts so many heritage buildings. So, it actually strengthens the community and brings people closer. And now, if you look at architectural conservation, it opens out a door to the past and we can actually learn from our culture and heritage. Now, what is the purpose? Here we have the Indus Valley civilization. What is the purpose of looking into a civilization that no one lives in? But we know how it is that our forefathers lived, how our ancestors lived, and that is intangibly important historic information which we cannot even assign a value to. We realize that there was a sense of urbanism at that point of time. We realize that our forefathers learned to build structures with such clear distinctive steps and usage. So, this is a very important purpose of architectural conservation. It helps us look into our past and learn from it as well. Particular styles are preserved, particular mistakes from the past needn't be repeated, and from our contemporary practices of architecture we can learn what are the different materials and technologies of construction that has been used in the past. The need for conservation, if you look at today, if you look at our society, it's obviously a very unique and civilized legacy that we have if you look at India's architectural heritage. But there are lots of sites and buildings that are unprotected. It is this unprotected sites that actually adds a value to our relevance and heritage to Indian society. So, this living heritage, it's living heritage because all these buildings, even though they are non-existent now in the sense in our minds, and there could be no one living in it, it has a large amount of stories and data that it can share with us through its architectural character. And that is why this is living heritage, and it is symbolic of our relationship with the natural environment as well as the built environment. Now, what is the particular need? We have to be aware as a common citizen, what is it that is around us? What is it that's there in terms of heritage in our city? For example, in a city like Chennai, I should know there are so many old buildings. I can learn so many things from these old buildings. And what is it that is I can learn from our history? Then obsolete rent control. When a particular building becomes obsolete or a series of buildings become obsolete, the area around it becomes antisocial elements will come around there. A lot of negative elements will come around those areas. So, it is very important to make sure these buildings are live and thriving. We do need to have external funding. For that, we need to realize the importance of our heritage. Without us realizing the importance of the heritage, we cannot expect a third person, an outsider, to come and give us money to conserve it. It is a knowledge resource like we just discussed. We can learn from our past, learn from the past mistakes, and we can actually save a lot of money in terms of cost, because if we reuse or adaptively reuse an old building, the need to construct new buildings will not be there, and we actually save a lot of money. Now, the object of conservation is very simple. It is our duty to actually realize that there is a tangible and intangible data that we can assign on value that we can assign to these buildings. This tangible heritage depends on the architectural character, the historic precincts that it stays in or lives in, the cities, the relationship to the natural surroundings, and the intangible is nothing but things like people living in that particular house. For example, there is the house of Subramanya Bharati in Triplicane. In terms of architectural character, it actually has no value. It has no objective to conserve that building, but Subramanya Bharatiyar was a very important person and part of Tamil history and Indian history. And a person like that lived with his family in that house. That is what assigns, and it is our objective to save this building and take it to the future generations as well. It could be kept as a museum for him, or it could be even used as a poet society to actually honor the profession he was involved in. Now we think of built heritage. Like we discussed till now, there is a natural heritage, built heritage, cultural heritage. If we actually just stick to built heritage, structures, the areas around the structures, surrounding areas which are in terms of landscaped areas, or it could be the architectural significance of these areas that are very important. Yes, the natural features are also important, but we will stick on to the important features as of now, the built heritage or the structure that is actually going to be considered important. Now, if you look at built heritage, you have economic, cultural and environmental. These three words are like a slogan that we need to remember. The conservation of built heritage is perceived only on these three terminologies. They needn't be mutually exclusive. For instance, a building that is culturally important could be even environmentally important and economically important, but a building that is only economically important could also be considered a part of our built heritage. They needn't be mutually exclusive, they could exist and coexist together. The goals, if you look at, it's very important to understand what is it that we are aiming at the end of this process. Yes, we have to retain the visual identity, we have to save the building as it is, but we have an option. Instead of just restoration or preservation, we can go in for rehabilitation, that is adaptive reuse, and make sure the building thrives. Even if it's in a new use, it thrives and can be taken to the future. Then we have local material and traditional building technology. This is a very crucial factor, because when we actually bring in materials that are imported from faraway places, the building is no longer sustainable. Even in mainstream architecture today, all that people talk about is green buildings, sustainable buildings, but when you actually think of conservation as a process, there is nothing more sustainable than conservation and nothing more green than using a building that has already been built. And if the changes incorporated in this course are using the local materials and the local traditional technology, we are generating local employment in terms of keeping these crafts alive and making sure that there is a sustainable development. Now, if you think of the ethics of conservation, right from the goals of conservation, we come on to the ethics. We have to make sure that the building is authentic, that it's true to its original style, that we do not tamper with it unnecessarily. And if at all there is a loss of a building, the conjecture that we derive from it, we cannot just decide that, oh, this is how the building looked. We should have relevant data, relevant information for us to decide that. And we should make sure that any changes that we bring about are actually true to its integrity and true to its age. A term like patina actually refers to how a building or how a material has aged over time. Now, if you look at a brass knob in an old building, it would have become a little dull, it will be a little brown in color, but that is considered normal. Over hundreds of years, the brass and materials like bronze will corrode, they will have some amount of discoloration. But if any kind of patina or any difference in the material has occurred such that it does not tamper with the structural stability of the building, We should let it be as it is. Now, having a bronze knob that is brown in color is not going to affect the structural stability of the building. So, let's not tamper with it. And most important, the rights of the indigenous community. Now, if it's not in an urban setting, but the building we are talking about is in a rural setting, like the Chettinad Palace in Kanadakatan or in Karaikudi, the people around that area derive some kind of employment from such places. It is first their right to make sure that situation continues. We cannot go tamper with such a situation and just remove them from their livelihood. And we should respect contributions of all periods. Like I mentioned with respect to the cathedral in Salerno, it is not up to us to just decide that okay, this was done in 1954, let's not keep this, this was done in 1970. As a conservation architect, we do not have a right to do that. We have to respect the contributions of all the different periods. And the next thing is we cannot distinguish the site from the building. The building and site coexist and it is inseparable. This bond has to be respected. That's another very important conservation ethic. Minimal intervention. We saw the different degrees of intervention. As far as possible, as the project demands it, let us keep it to a minimum possible, such that there is a minimal loss of fabric and it is reversible. Any change as a conservation architect that I bring about has to be reversible. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, there could be a better technology, and at that point of time, this change should be removed and a new one could be applied. So, it's very important that the changes are brought about in a legible and reversible fashion. Demolition and rebuilding should be kept for the last resort when there is no other way out. Now, what is this need for this architectural conservation? Like we have discussed, it is a message from the past. It is our duty to actually pass on this richness in its authentic form to the future generations, and it is very important that we safeguard them. Now, we come on to adaptive reuse. What are the principles of adaptive reuse? It is economically sensible, number one. Number two, if we actually assign a new use to a building, it is an ideal heritage property because we carry on the heritage and the history of the building, but with a new use, we make sure that it's revived and it is approachable to all segments of society. It prolongs the life of the building and henceforth the future generations can also enjoy it. And while we are doing this, we have to make sure we give priority to the original function. But if that original function is obsolete or does not make sense in today's context, we can assign a new function to it. For example, it could be a palace. Today, no kings and queens exist to actually live in that palace, so it could be made into a heritage hotel. So, things like this are of course permitted. If a new use is allowed, it has to conform to the original design of the building. It cannot be something that is totally unrelated. You can't have a discotheque inside a cathedral or a temple. All those things is not possible. So, as far as a new use is conformed to the purpose and style of the building, it is allowable. But any changes that is brought about has to be done only after complete set of documentation. It's very important that we have a series of documentations or documents which state the current status of the building, and any change that is brought about is also documented. So, 20 years or 30 years from now, if this project comes up again, the next person who is working on it knows exactly the interventions that have happened and at what time it has happened. And we have to respect the building as a whole. We can't just look at a column and say, okay, this is unstable, let's just rebuild it. How important is that column? Do we have evidence that this column looks like this in another place? Let us do it in the best way possible to the true style of architecture. And another very important thing here is the external facade of the building should never be tampered with, because the locals and the people around associate themselves to that building only by the look of the building. The interiors may have to be removed, may have to be changed for the new purpose. If as far as it's not completely changed, it is allowable, but the external facade should never be tampered with. And any major changes brought about in a heritage building has to be discussed with the local community, and this is where the local authorities come into being. Now, if you look at the principles of restoration, replication, of rebuilding, now from adaptive reuse, we saw it has an economic background. Here, what happens is the stress is more on reinstating the integrity of the building. We want to make sure that the building remains as it is, and if at all we want to make new buildings surrounding this building, we have to make sure it's replicated accordingly. And no rebuilding, if at all needs to be done, has to be done only because of dire circumstances like a flood, earthquake or something like that. So, these are buildings that are usually of national importance, which you don't want to tamper the use with. They are monuments like Taj Mahal, Humayun's tomb. No one wants to actually restore it or rehabilitate it into a new purpose. As it is, it has a lot of value. So, let us make sure that the visual and experiential quality of this does not change, and any interventions made is only purely done for repair perspective, and we do not hamper the building unnecessarily. Employment generation is very important. Let it be restoration, let it be rehabilitation or adaptive reuse. We employ local labor and materials and the traditional ways of building. For instance, when a Chettinad palace in Karnataka is restored, I go to the tile makers of Athangudi. I actually go to the Chettinad lime plaster people to do my plaster work. So, these traditional methods of construction which otherwise will die are given a new life. So, that is a very important byproduct of conservation in terms of adaptive reuse or restoration. Then we have local material and traditional technology. Following the same example, now if you go to Athangudi and the Chettinad lime plaster, we come to know of materials which we otherwise would not use. Egg white, lime, shell lime, which is not in current use at all. But keeping all of this in mind, yes, there are modern substances that can be replaced. They can replace all of these materials. But when we are doing a conservation project, it's important that we are true to the historic context, and to the level possible, to the maximum level possible, we should ensure that these substitutes are minimized. At the very same time, like we initially spoke about, it is very important that we even conserve our environment. So, if it is a material that is going to hamper our environment, like excessive wood, which leads to deforestation, or it could be use of shell lime, which is from the coastal areas and it is eroding the coastline. So, things like this, or lead paint, which is actually poisonous now after series of scientific experiments. So, if these elements or materials have been used in these historic buildings, it is our job not to use these materials. Just because it is historic, we should not be using it, because it is going to dampen and hamper our society. Now, we think of integrated conservation and sustainability. There is nothing more sustainable than using a building that has already been constructed. It is as green as it can. We can actually extend the quality of life of the local community, if we are thinking even of the urban sector, or let it be the rural sector. Now, if you look at a place like Mahabalipuram, for example, the entire city thrives, the town thrives because of tourism. So, in terms of sustaining the building or the traditional skills or the knowledge, it is all maintained by a strong economic backbone. Now, you come on to urban conservation. How different is it from architectural conservation? Urban conservation is not very different if you actually look at it. The only thing different is the scale. Architectural conservation deals with one building, with one monument, versus urban conservation looks at an entire historic urban core. They share the same principles, procedure as well as the outcome. Whereas urban conservation, it goes into a deeper level. It actually consists multi-levels of conservation and multi-layers of conservation. So, if you look at an example, if you have an urban conservation project within Chennai or Madras, you have the old 7 villages, places like Triplicane, Mylapore, Pursavakam, all of these are urban conservation projects, because the entire urban core is part of the historic fabric. It is just not one particular building or one particular temple that we are talking about. So, it is very important that we learn that the urban conservation not only affects the quality of architectural style, but also affects the quality of the physical environment. But you cannot say that we cannot have modernization happening there. Then that whole society will get stopped in time. They will not be able to compete with the rest of the town. So it's very important that any changes that are brought about, it is with keeping in mind that yes, the society has to move on to the next century, but not hampering the historic integrity or the architectural integrity of the place. So this is where the whole concept of global cultural tourism has come about. So lots of people come, and the whole attraction is the whole old style living. So people come to Mylapore to see the Thinnai, to see the temple. So we have to make sure that the elements that are actually the USP of that place, we are not tampered with. Let's not directly go around building huge hoardings that are even taller than the Gopuram. We have to make sure that it is done holistically. So this is where urban conservation is centrally concerned with the preservation of buildings, but in a larger scale. It is a group of buildings that it deals with, and just not one particular building. Now, the benefit of urban conservation, if you look at its culture and economy. Economy and culture, we have discussed, go hand in hand. You cannot decide that without economics, a heritage project is not possible, because a lot of funding is required. So cultural endowments actually decide the architecture, the unique streetscape, and the historic sites are increasingly recognized because of these. So it's very important for developing countries, especially because we get a lot of money through tourism. If you look at all these foreign tourists who visit our country, there are pockets that they go to visit. They go to Delhi, and from Delhi there's a quadrangle that they go to. They go to Amritsar, Agra and Chandigarh. So there is a particular pattern that develops because of heritage. Again, when tourists come to Tamil Nadu, they have Chennai, they have Madurai, they have Trichy and Kanyakumari. So when they actually have these pockets that are developing because of heritage. And it's very important that we improve this quality of conservation and management of urban heritage. So all this comes under urban conservation, because we are talking of entire towns and cities that need to develop to support tourist activities. At the same time, it has to preserve its historic significance. So it has to have and work in a particular work balance and make sure the city is livable. It's competing with the other global cities of the world. It is giving income earning opportunities to the people of the city. At the same time, people have a sense of pride belonging to that city because of its historical background, historical significance, and historical buildings could be like temples or monuments or churches. So this is one of the most important examples that we will be looking at. This is in Iran. This is a site that has actually changed the entire situation in Iran. Thousands and lakhs of people come here to Kermanshah. It actually attracts tourism, investments come in because of it, and a similar thing has to be done our tourist sites over here. So the investment in heritage tourism and heritage conservation and urban conservation is literally an investment, like a business investment. It's not intangible that we are just talking about preserving our heritage. We have to make sure that these improvements support tourism, not only to enhance the life of the residents, but also to increase economic opportunities and standard of living, but also to ensure that we are able to satisfy international tourists. Now we come on to global agencies. The global agencies in this world we will be looking at here are UNESCO, ICOMOS and ICCROM. UNESCO actually is United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. It's a branch of United Nations. ICOMOS is International Council on Monuments and Sites. We will be dealing with a couple of them in detail. Now if you look at UNESCO, their main aim was to actually create a heritage list for the entire world. Let's mark just not built heritage sites, but also natural landscape sites, cultural sites that are historically important, and make sure that it is surviving for the future. So this is a prime example here. You have Stonehenge, which is nothing but a random arrangement of stones, which has been there for so many years, literally thousands of years. And here you have a particular set rules now. People can't randomly enter Stonehenge. There is a particular set of footfall of people that is allowed. All this has happened only because of the intervention of UNESCO. These are some of the sites in India that is protected by UNESCO. This is Champaner in Gujarat. Here you have the particular building the details of the building articulated over here and why is it that it is important. All of these buildings in Champaner, the monuments, have received funding from the World Monument Fund, from the government, only after it has been recognized by UNESCO. This is the Pattadakal in Karnataka, which is near Hampi. This again you can see all of this has been restored and retained only because of funding. This is INTBAU, the International Network for Traditional Building, Architectural and Urbanism. While UNESCO is a more generic term where it actually just does for all cultural buildings and all cultural sites, INTBAU is specific for traditional building, architecture and urbanism. So, it has a number of Indian partners. You have the Nabha Foundation, INTAC, UNESCO India. So, what they promote here doing is they want to educate and train people on these different styles of traditional architecture, urbanism and crafts. So, they want to create a dialogue between conservation architects, artisans, urban town planners and everybody. So, it is to improve the quality of heritage cities, towns and villages. That is the aim of INTBAU. This is an example in Italy and this is Madgaon in Goa, India. So, these are taken over, like in the urban core is taken over by INTBAU and they give suggestions how these urban cores could be treated physically as well as to give it a better background and to make it more attractive to tourists and how a country can even make money off it. This is in Netherlands, Nigeria and Romania. All these have improved its sites because of INTBAU. Now, we come on to ICOMOS, which is the International Council on Monuments and Sites. So, as the word suggests, they concentrate only on monuments and sites. Where you saw UNESCO doing general cultural work, then we saw INTBAU doing urbanism and methods of building construction. ICOMOS is specifically only for monuments and the sites surrounding these monuments. So, they concentrate on the cultural landscape and archaeological sites. So, it is a combination of architects, historians, archaeologists and geographers. So, this is an example of what ICOMOS does. Here you have Buddhas of Bamiyan Valley in Afghanistan. This was completely destroyed during war, but now they have ICOMOS has stepped in and they are trying to do best to restore it. And finally, we have ICCROM, which is the International Center for the Study of Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property. So, ICCROM is even more specific to conservation projects. As in a more increasing fashion, we have come to an agency that is even more authoritative on restoration of projects. So, ICCROM does what other agencies cannot do for conservation. That is exactly what ICCROM is looking into. For example, over here you see this is the Sigiriya frescoes of Sri Lanka, which is there in which was tampered with a particular person, and at once ICCROM sent a particular person from Italy to rework on this and it was done right away. So, their concentration is in the preservation and restoration of cultural property. Now, this is the end of the global agencies. To conclude our lecture, we will discuss what is it that we have learnt in this session. We have continued with a discussion on architectural conservation. We have clearly defined the need and purpose of architectural conservation, and next we have differentiated urban conservation from architectural conservation. And when we are talking of conservation in a global context, we have discussed the role of agencies like ICOMOS, UNESCO and ICCROM. The next thing, we should be able to answer these questions, differentiating between architectural conservation and urban conservation. What are the benefits of urban conservation? Name 2 international agencies involved in the preservation of built heritage and briefly discuss their contribution. That is the end of the session. Thank you.